Thank you so much. What an amazing welcome. I'm going to have to come to Texas more often. Texas is still a place that I consider, it's a former home. I lived here for 2 years in the lower Rio Grande Valley as a missionary, and my mom grew up in El Paso. So I consider Texas sort of my former home, my ancestral home. It's also my backup home, because the truth is, if everything goes to pot, we're all going to Texas. I'm honored also to be here with my wife, Sharon. Sharon, wave to everyone. Sharon is my best friend, the mother of my 3 children, my wife, and the source of most of my good ideas. If you ever hear me say anything profound, odds are pretty good it came from Sharon first. We met in a high school journalism class. We had the state award-winning newspaper team. And, you know, the teacher loved Sharon. She liked me, but she loved Sharon, would routinely remind all of us that Sharon was the smartest one in the class. And so Sharon doesn't ever have to remind me of that. She'll just tell a story about Miss Jarman, and then I get the message. But, you know, it really is a good thing to be among people who love liberty and understand what it means, because it's never been more important than it is right now to stand up for liberty, because liberty is under assault. In part because people don't know what it means and they don't understand why it's so important. And that's why we have to stand together to do it. Brooke, thank you so much for your kind introduction. I wish I could bottle that. As you were saying it, I was thinking, it's too late now for me to break out my iPhone and start recording it like a fanboy of some sort. I need to hear those words from time to time when I get down, because, man, that was awesome. And I'm in a tough re-elect fight right now. My opponent ran a poll last night showing him within the low single digits of beating me. And he runs on this idea that, oh, Mike Lee doesn't know what he's doing, can't get anything done, but he doesn't know Brooke Rollins. And you know, I wish you could hear that message. I'll beat him, but he's making it tough. She mentioned our work on criminal justice reform, and I was so glad to hear Jack's message. So inspiring. I love watching him on TV, and every time I've heard him speak, I've been inspired. But I remember how pleased I was when Brooke Rollins came to the White House, because I knew that was a massive shift toward allowing us to get things done. We've had so much support for this effort over the years, from Deason to so many of you in this room, to Brooke, who have worked on criminal justice reform. And everything came together magically during the Trump administration to where we could get it done. I still remember very vividly the exact moment in July of 2018, when that moment arrived, when we knew that we had achieved a compromise. I finally got Dick Durbin, Cory Booker, and a whole bunch of Republicans all on the same page with a concept. Jared Kushner and Brooke Rollins and I have been working for literally 18 months, the first 18 months of the Trump administration, to get to that point where we had alignment in concept on what we could do. We knew we had to present it to President Trump in a way that would be appealing to him, and in a way that would make clear to him that this was a fleeting but huge opportunity for it to make a big difference to the country. And we prepared our remarks. It brought me in. They assigned me with the task of giving him the elevator speech within the Oval Office. We went into the Oval Office. Brooke was in there. It was me, Lindsey Graham, Chuck Grassley, and Tim Scott. Then we had Jared Kushner and Brooke Rollins in the room, and the president was sitting behind the Resolute desk. We were sitting immediately in front of it. I had carefully prepared this thing. I knew it was important. I knew this was perhaps the most important presentation I would ever make during my political career. I've been working on this project for a solid decade, and I knew I had to get it right. I knew it couldn't be too long, or else I'd bore him. I knew it couldn't be too short, or else I'd leave out an important point. So I distilled it to exactly 2 minutes. In order to emphasize and make the point, I tapped lightly on the Resolute desk in the middle of the speech, and it seemed to echo. So note to self, whenever you're talking to the President of the United States and you're sitting at the Resolute desk, if you tap on it, it'll echo. I was scared to death that the Secret Service was going to barge in, kick down the door, and assume something had gone terribly wrong. And but they didn't. It all worked out well. At the conclusion of this presentation, my heart was pounding at the end of it, but you couldn't see it from the outside because I made sure that I was calm in the way I presented it. The moment of truth had arrived. He leaned back, inhaled deeply, and he says, "Mike, do you know why they don't have a drug problem in China?" And I said, I'm not sure that I do. He said, "Well, I asked President Xi. I said, 200 years ago, your people had a drug problem, very serious, very sad. Lots of opium. Your people were addicted, ours were not. Today, ours are, yours are not. Why?" And he said, now I warn you here, this will be me imitating Trump, imitating Xi Jinping. I asked him and he said, "It's because we kill them." At this point, Brooke and Jared and I were stumped, and we knew what was coming next. And yes, we're all thinking the same thing. Lindsey Graham was foaming at the mouth and already blurting out words like, "Yeah, Mike, let's change the bill. Let's kill them all." I gave him that look, if you're married, that look that your spouse gives you, like, not now. Lindsey, not the appropriate time. But he wasn't finished yet. I thought he was finished with that part, and I thought maybe this is rhetorical. And he said, "Yeah, here's what they do. If they're caught with drugs, they give them a trial. If they're found guilty, which they always are, no appeal, they take them out into a field and shoot them." And I thought, okay, I'm truly stumped here. This is a curveball I did not expect. And but he still wasn't finished. Then I talked to Kim Jong-un. They do the same thing in North Korea. So at that point, I said, "Mr. President, there's some reasons why what works in a communist totalitarian regime somewhere in Asia, like say China or North Korea, for example, might not work as well in the United States." "What are those reasons, Mike? Enlighten me." Well, some of them are cultural. A Confucius culture, greater good, individual rights don't matter as much as compared to a Judeo-Christian culture. Individual rights matter because we all have eternal worth. I was boring him by that point. Some of them are cultural and some of them are constitutional. And he goes, "Yeah, but by the time we're finished with the Supreme Court, some of those constitutional reasons might go away, am I right?" He was obviously just messing with me. And I can't blame him for doing so. He could tell how important this was with me. He had to have some fun with it. And at that point, he leaned back and he said, "Okay, we'll do it." It took us about 6 more months to get everything in written form and get everyone to agree. They still, the naysayers were saying, "Oh, they'll never get to 60. And I said, well, in a moment of braggadocio, I said, no, we will get to 60. In fact, we'll get to 70. We ended up with 87 votes on the First Step Act, and we got it passed. So why does that matter? Why did it matter so much that we did that? It mattered because people matter. It mattered because what makes us different as a country, what makes us free. It's not our government, not even necessarily our form of government. It's our people, it's our culture, it's what we ourselves understand about who we are. It's what we believe about the inherent dignity and eternal value and significance of the individual soul. And yes, it also has something to do with our form of government. Our form of government, because it was written by a God-fearing people who understood the inherent value and eternal significance of the immortal human soul. We put together a document to make sure that no government could ever commandeer that culture and that understanding and that deep and abiding belief about who we are. about how we treat each other, about why that matters, and about why freedom matters. You see, it's my belief, as it was that of the founding generation, that we are creations of God, that we're all created in the image of God. And built into that belief, along with the natural law provided to us by Him, is the understanding that freedom is a good thing, that God wants us to be happy. He wants us to thrive. He wants us to be free, not just because it sounds awesome when you get up in front of a big crowd and shout freedom, and it does, but because of the good things that free people do. Human flourishing is possible only when freedom is allowed. Governments present a potential threat to that. It's a paradox. It's a paradox because on the one hand, we can't be truly free unless we have government. Because if we had no government, we'd have anarchy. If we had anarchy, we would all be so busy standing guard over our hovels, making sure that someone didn't steal whatever scraps of food were inside of our hovels, that we wouldn't have time to engage in creative or productive activities. Education would become difficult to impossible. Human flourishing could never occur, so we must have government. But on the other end of the spectrum, when government oversteps its bounds, freedom becomes impossible. Government's there to allow us to outsource the official power to use force to protect life, liberty, and property, the essential preconditions of human happiness and flourishing. And so in order to provide this balance between, on the one hand, the need to avoid anarchy, on the other hand, the need to avoid a totalitarian government that would actually undercut those same interests for which government was created, life, liberty, and property, the essential preconditions of human flourishing and human happiness. Our founding fathers, I believe wise men raised up by Almighty God to that very purpose, put together this document. This document, to the extent we follow it, to the extent we have followed it, has helped foster the development of the greatest civilization the world has ever known. Because it is, as my wife Sharon likes to say, fundamentally an economic document. We argued about this for years, by the way. Is it an economic document? She'd make the point that it was, and I'd say, no, it's actually a legal document. It's economic. And finally, I realized she's right. Not just because she's my wife and because Ms. Jarman said she's smarter than I am, which she is, but because of this very thing. What enabled it to come together were economic interest, enlightened self-interest of those who understood this tension between life, liberty, and property and government. There's an understanding that creeps into any society where government starts to believe that whatever belongs to the subjects of a government belongs to the government presumptively itself. It's there to be used at the sufferance. It's there to be used by permission of the sovereign. That's why we reinvented the whole program. We made clear that the people are the sovereigns, not some monarch, and that the people will at all times, remain in control of their own government. That's why we're in good hands, and that's why this document, to the extent we followed it, has fostered the development of not just the greatest civilization, but the most economically prosperous one, and the civilization in the history of the world with the greatest degree of upward economic mobility. You see, you look at when I talk about the good things that free people do when they're simply allowed to be free, you think about the free markets and the institutions of civil society that have been formed as a result of the fact that we have these protections in place, this economic document that Sharon points out. They have lifted more people out of poverty than any government program ever has, ever could, or ever will. That's why I follow it. That's why I'm determined to continue following it. It's also why it's fallen out of fashion in Washington to follow it, because Washington wants only one thing, which is to aggregate power to Washington itself. It's also one of the reasons why I wrote this book, Saving Nine. It's my belief that the Constitution works because of the way that it distributes power. Bad things happen when we allow concentrated and unfettered power to exist. Too often we think of the Constitution as something that is synonymous with the Bill of Rights. Bill of Rights, very important. The Bill of Rights is not the part of the Constitution whose birthday we celebrated, whose 235th birthday we celebrated just 6 days ago. That document, the original document, has the motherlode of protections, the structural protections. The Bill of Rights, very important, but the Bill of Rights will mean nothing as long as the structural protections of the original Constitution are weak. If, on the other hand, those structural protections are strong, there will always be a way to make sure that we honor the freedom of press, the freedom of religion, the right and the protection against self-incrimination, the freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures, something that's under threat to a tremendous degree right now. It's the structural protections that get neglected. Structural protections operate along these two axes, one vertical, the other horizontal. I won't dwell long on them, but the vertical protection is the one that we call federalism, that keeps most of the power close to you at the state and local level. I'm going to go out on a limb here and guess that most of you, from time to time, run into your state lawmakers, maybe at the grocery store, maybe at your child's or grandchild's ballet recital or baseball game. You're less likely to run into your U.S. Senator or U.S. Congressman as often. It's one of the reasons why we keep most of the power close to the people. That's the vertical protection we call federalism. Keeps any one person within our system from being too powerful. And there's the horizontal protection that says within the limited purpose national government that's supposed to be in charge of just a few things, weights and measures, trademarks, copyrights and patents, national defense, declaring war, regulating trade between the states and with foreign nations. That's about it. But within that federal government that's supposed to be narrow, we're going to have one branch that makes the laws, one branch that enforces the laws, or is supposed to, one branch that interprets the laws where people disagree as to its meaning. As long as each branch stays within its lane and we respect the proper distribution of power between national government and local government, things work well. Look at what happened from the moment we started with the signing and later the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Up until, fast forward 150 years, so much of that progress came about as a direct result of the fact that we followed that stuff really, really tightly for the first 150 years of the Republic. Now, we've continued to succeed in many respects since then, but we've seen a deterioration, a simultaneous departure from both federalism and separation of powers from one distinct moment. And it's a moment that's never discussed in high school civics class. To the extent they still teach high school civics, they never talk about this. That, by the way, is where we get this mistaken understanding that the Constitution itself is synonymous with what the Supreme Court says it is, and that it's synonymous more or less with the Bill of Rights, which is only part of the picture. But we've departed from that over the last 85 years, from both of those protections. And as we've done it, we've become incrementally less free. We've jeopardized our Bill of Rights protections, and we see our freedom being taken away by degrees. But I trace this back to one day, one distinct day, a day that I talk about in Saving Nine. That day was April 12th, 1937, a day that should live in infamy for all of the time that the American Republic exists and remains on this earth, but a day that you'll never be taught about. That was a day the Supreme Court made a decision bringing about a significant amendment to the Constitution, but without going through the amendment process. Had it been an actual amendment to the Constitution, it would have been regarded to this day as perhaps one of the 2 or 3 most impactful amendments on the Constitution, but they didn't bother to go through that. No. Through one ruling in a case called NLRB versus Jones and Laughlin Steel, the Supreme Court blew up one provision of Article 1, Section 8. That is Clause 3, the power to regulate commerce between the states with foreign nations and with the Indian tribes. It went from being a part of the Constitution that gave Congress and the federal government the power to regulate trade, interstate commercial transactions, and channels and instrumentalities of interstate commerce. Think of interstate airways, airwaves, waterways, canals, and so forth. Things moving in interstate commerce. It went from that, which is a relatively narrow power, because you can't have multifarious, inconsistent state law regulation of the same thing. It It would be chaos. To where they blew it up completely. And in that case, they reinterpreted, reimagined, and amended it to be something else, which is Congress now has the power to regulate any economic activity that, when measured in the aggregate, has a significant impact on interstate commerce. What that means, effectively, is that Congress may now regulate anything as long as it has decent draftsmen. As long as those draftsmen can draw some type of an attenuated chain back to a substantial effect on interstate commerce, Congress may now regulate it. If you don't believe me, read Saving 9, where I explained that since that date, some 85 and a half years ago, the Supreme Court has knocked down exactly only two pieces of legislation on grounds that it exceeded Congress's Commerce Clause power. We almost got there on a third. One dealt with provisions of the Violence Against Women Act. Another dealt with bare non-commercial possession of a gun in a school zone. And a third that we almost got to was Obamacare's individual mandate. But the Chief Justice, not so courteously, rewrote the statute and the law so as to make it a tax and not an exercise of the Commerce Clause power, so they got around that one. That's why I explain in Saving 9 that the Supreme Court is so important, and it's so important to preserve and protect. This, too, is a paradox. Because, as I explained in Saving 9, the United States Supreme Court and the federal judiciary as a whole is actually the least dangerous branch. It is the least powerful branch by a mile. You think about the three branches of the federal government. It's basically two pens and a sword. You got the legislative pen, which prescribes what shall be, what the law is, what the law will be within the federal government. You've got the executive branch, which wields a sword. It breaks out the sword and points the sword at you and says, if you don't comply, you're going to get the sword. So most people comply. Then you've got the judicial pen that resolves differences between what people think the legislative branch enacted. So in that respect, the judicial branch is by far the weakest, and by design. But like the keystone in a Roman arch, even though the keystone isn't itself load-bearing, it's the linchpin of the whole thing. You take it out, everything else goes away. And I wrote Saving 9 because the judiciary is under threat. It is under threat in a way that through legislation that I would add could be enacted and would technically be constitutional. If they, by simple legislation, which they have the power to do, if they increase the number of justices on the Supreme Court, not because of an exacting, demanding workload that 9 justices weren't able to keep up with, but rather because they wanted to impact the political outcome of the court's substantive rulings, that would be constitutional, not unconstitutional. But it would be severely, profoundly, irreversibly anti-constitutional. It would remove the keystone. Everything else crumbles. Because without an independent federal judiciary, one determined and focused to do only one thing, which is resolve disputes by correctly interpreting the law and the Constitution, everything else crumbles. Let's go back to the beginning. Why does this matter? Why should we be concerned about what 9 lawyers wearing robes in Washington, D.C. do? And whether it is, in fact, 9 after all, because 9 isn't prescribed by the Constitution. It is rather statutory. And as I explained in Saving 9, it's evolved in an iterative process by Congress over the last 2.5 centuries. But it has nonetheless been in effect for over 150 years. And that's why we need to stick with it. I thought this was just setting me up for an emotional, rousing conclusion of my speech. This is why it matters. It matters because you matter. It matters because of the inherent dignity and eternal significance of the immortal human soul. This is how that significance is protected. It's how your individual lives are protected, how your ability to earn a living, provide for your families, and do what you do best is protected. I believe in God. I believe the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the same God who warned the prophet Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 8 about the risks and the harms that Israel would incur if it sought after a king. He warned the people. He said, Israelites, don't do this thing. If you have a king, remember they came to Samuel, and Samuel went to the Lord. They said, we want a king. We want a king because a king will make us great. A king will fight our battles. We want to be like the other nations. We want to be in the cool kids club. And God told Samuel, and Samuel told the people, a king will take your sons and send them into battles of his own choosing and his own making, in his own interest and not yours. A king will take your daughters and he will make them his maids and his pastry chefs. He will take your flocks and your herds for his own to sustain his armies. He will take your horses and he will ride with them into battle. Ladies and gentlemen, God wasn't just warning us about the risks of a monarchy. He was doing that too, to be sure. He was also warning us about government itself. It's that same God, I believe, that helped bring forth these wise men who, some 235 years ago, had you in mind, had your eternal value, had your welfare, your happiness in mind when they put together this document. It's worth protecting because your freedom is worth protecting. Thank you very much.
I think I need a microphone. Well, does Mike Lee not give you hope in our United States Senate? I mean, he really is that remarkable. I was scrolling through my phone back to late 2018 when we were pushing through the First Step Act, and it was just the two of us on a text. I'm sure you had lots of others, but just the two of us, and we were back and forth about 30 times a day. And, you know, this is how in the weeds he was. Okay, I just talked to Senator so-and-so, and they're a soft yes, but here's how we get to a hard yes. This is on the First Step Act. So it actually was encouraging to me also, having not really worked that closely. Eventually I did other bills as well, but that was my first one. But you were just such a warrior on that, on so many other things, Senator. Thank you. And I'm not sure anyone laughed harder than I did at your impression of our meeting in the Oval Office, having lived those multiple times a day.
Was it accurate?
It was so accurate. I kept looking at Tim and Terry and being like, that actually is completely true. And one of the things I think it'd be fun for us to talk about specific to that, and then we'll dive more into the Constitution. We've got about 15 minutes, which will be fun, and open it up too for any questions. But people would prepare for weeks to come in to those meetings, and they were important. I mean, the President of the United States was making very big decisions, and he was relying on those who would provide the information. But my first meeting was much the same, where I prepared, and immediately, you know, we went off in a different direction. But we always circled back, always, and the right decisions were usually always made. But from your perspective as a senator and working with the Trump White House versus the White Houses before, how is it different? Better, worse, different?
First of all, it was the funnest White House ever because it was such an engaging environment. The president has, the 45th president of the United States has boundless curiosity. And I think intellectual curiosity is one of the best characteristics of any public servant, especially a president of the United States. He was genuinely curious about all sorts of things. And it's one of the things I found so refreshing about him. In a particular conversation, he would ask about 25 different topics because he was genuinely curious. And that made for a lively, robust environment in which good public policy could be developed. The Obama White House was engaged on this issue And, this is one of the few things that Barack Obama and I agreed on, and so we would talk about this from time to time, and he invited me down to the White House fairly regularly to talk about it. But it wasn't the same. President Trump himself was directly engaged. His staff followed suit and was also very curious and wanted to make sure they got it right. And by the way, and then the Biden White House, not fun. First time I went over there, after the change in administrations, it was depressing. It was just sad. The 46th president was in Delaware at the time, so it was really quiet anyway. But I kept thinking, any minute, Donald Trump's going to open the door and say, "I was just joking."
It's so great. That's a very good impression. It's remarkable to hear you so effortlessly weave your way through the narrative of your book and why it's important. But as we all know, we live in a culture and a society where we're trying to change hearts and minds all the time, that we talked about with Jack. How do you think, Senator, we take the complicated, beautiful, but nevertheless difficult subject of what you have written about, and how do we take that to the masses and make sure they understand the importance, especially with the current education system being so against everything that is true, that we know to be true?
I think two essential elements of that effort have to exist. Number one, simplicity and granularity, meaning break it down into digestible, bite-sized points. Not everybody is up for my little speech about the vertical and the horizontal separation of powers. I like to think you guys didn't hate it, but not everybody has as much enthusiasm for that. But it does help to just explain things in very simple form by saying we've got three different branches in our federal government, and one that makes the laws, one that interprets them, one that enforces them, and break it down simply like that. And then second, lead it to something. Lead it to something that has an emotional appeal. Explain to them why it should matter to them. This matters to you because otherwise government can take too much of your stuff. You don't want to work, you're already working months out of the year just to pay your federal taxes, and then you're told it's not nearly enough because we're $31 trillion in debt. Do you want to work even more? Do you want to work 6 months instead of 4 for the federal government? And most people will say, hell no. And are we allowed to say hell in Texas?
Yes, you're allowed to say that in Texas.
Frowned upon in Utah. We have all sorts of substitutes. Heck, golly gee.
Well, I think that's right, and I do think that is one of the most important things that we have to recognize as conservatives and those trying to win a country for 100 more years or 235 more years to keep the republic going. And I think that this organization, TPPF, and really for so many years ago, Tim, I remember when we were fighting the new margins tax. I mean, this is almost 20 years ago, and it was basically the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and there were 6 of us at the time. And Ken Paxton, as a state representative, was one of 5 of the state representatives that was willing to say the margins tax is a really bad idea. Of course, business income tax. That's exact. Thank you, Tim. We were messaging even back then. And keep in mind, on the other side was Rick Perry, Tom Craddock, David Dewhurst, all the media, everybody. But I remember back then the discussions were we have to make a case to the people that a business income tax is not about taxing business, that the people it hurts the most are those at the bottom end of the scale. Now, we lost that fight, but I think it set up the foundation for a lot of winnings that we've done since then. But from your perspective in the United States Senate and seeing those same fights occur, watching a midterm that is just around the corner, understanding you're in the middle of that as well, the prayer for a new Congress and maybe even a new U.S. Senate, what do we need to do as a collective body in what we believe in being better organized and better unified and providing a vision for America? And the one final thing I'll say that, and they want your thoughts. I think you weren't here yet, but I mentioned this morning that Kevin McCarthy and his team are unveiling their commitment to America, their vision, right now in Pittsburgh at this moment. We don't hear that from the United States Senate. I know there's a lot of frustration about that, but your thoughts on that would be really, really welcome, and then what we can do to help move that vision forward.
Yeah. Okay, on the first part of the question, I totally agree with you on corporate tax, and this is actually a good example and a good model for how we can share the vision. One of the reasons why I hate the corporate tax is that it's really a badly, thinly disguised tax on America's poor and middle class. It's a tax on the little guy. But by the way, if you haven't read it, please read Amity Shlaes's book called The Forgotten Man. We've all gone through school, whether you went to private or public school, or regardless of what part of the country. We've all been raised thinking, oh, the New Deal brought an end to the Great Depression. Nonsense. It prolonged it. Amity Shlaes makes the economic and political and historical case very abundantly that the New Deal prolonged it. It exacerbated the plight of poor middle-class America. And we've got to translate that stuff better. We have been badly lampooned. For a while, we were willing to wear the label as if it were a badge of honor of the party of the top 1% and the country club and of Wall Street. It's just not who we are, and it's not even where our political philosophy stems from. It's not our orientation of it. We're opposed to the corporate tax because it's a thinly disguised way of sticking it to consumers. It's not wealthy people who can be lampooned as like a Monopoly game piece figure with a double-breasted suit and a monocle. Doesn't look like Mr. Peanut walking on Wall Street. This is a tax on real hard workers because everybody pays for those. It's not the wealthy who pays for those. It's the consumer who pays for it through higher prices on goods, higher prices on services, diminished wages, unemployment, and underemployment. And so I think that's how we win that, and the emotional appeal is by making clear that anytime government expands, it expands at the expense of individual liberty, and 99.9% of the time. That means at the direct and disproportionate expense of low and middle income earners. So that's how we get there. All right, as to the second point, the agenda point. This does represent a significant difference of opinion among and between Republicans. I'm glad that Kevin McCarthy is outlining something today. I look forward to seeing what that is. I fear that it might, well, I hope that it doesn't look like essentially the following, which would be more awesome. Lower taxes, badass policies, Biden sucks. You know, that's not an agenda. If you outline broad platitudes and outcomes, it's like the person running for junior class president in high school. We're going to have funner activities. It's going to be... we need actual policies. It doesn't have to be long because you don't want to lose the conciseness of your message. If it were up to me, and I do think we need a centralized message, here's what it would look like for me. I would pick three, and my three would be, if you elect us, we will pass the REINS Act because laws should be written by our own elected representatives, not unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats. Number two, thank you. In fact, if a genie appeared to me and said, you may pass any one piece of legislation now filed, it would be the REINS Act. It would provide the biggest rebalancing of both the vertical and the horizontal separation of powers that I described a minute ago. It would be revolutionary. It would change everything. That's the one I would do. Number two would probably be a transition to a flat tax. And number three would be procedural spending reform in a package that would include the Full Faith and Credit Act and the Government Shutdown Prevention Act, so that we stop this barbaric practice of allowing the law firm of Schumer, McConnell, Pelosi, McCarthy to wait until hours before the expiration of a spending deadline. Then they walk in with this 2,000-page bill and say, oh, gee, this came from the heavens. This is all we have to pass. You got to pass this thing, or we're going to go into a shutdown. And by the way, there are all sorts of special interest giveaways for Kentucky horse breeders and distillers of bourbon and a few California winery interests in it. And by the way, it leads us to spend $1 trillion more than we should be spending. But you don't want to shut down. You got to feed the troops, so pass it. That's what I would do. But there is this difference of opinion on this issue. A bunch of us, I actually think most of us would prefer that we have an overt agenda. Here's what we will do. And those would be my three. We could have a really interesting discussion about what else should be in there. Maybe I got that right, maybe I didn't. But what we have right now is leadership in the Senate that has said no. Not only do I not agree with your list, I don't agree with the idea of having a list. All we want to say is Joe Biden sucks. And I understand that. He's pretty awful. But we do need to tell them what we're for, because that says as much about how we'll vote as anything.
And I often think that's why we lose and have lost certain parts of our country that we've got to win back, because we are not providing the vision. And that's what I think TPPF changed in Texas, and hopefully DeSantis is in Florida and others. Okay, let me open it up. We've got time for a couple of questions. How do we do that?
How do we do what?
How do we provide a vision from our good friends in leadership?
Yep. It's difficult to take someone who doesn't see something and convince them to see what's right in front of us. I've tried a lot to convince our leadership to embrace this vision. One of the frustrating parts about it is that I know everyone else in our movement can see it as well. Perhaps he's seeing something different that I'm not, but I'm not willing to just accept on faith that Mitch McConnell's idea is the preferable one. In time, these things make a difference. And in time, differences can be discerned between those who would choose to be leaders. At some point in the next few years, there will be opportunities, and maybe that's nearer term, maybe that's a few months away, maybe it's 2 years, or maybe it's 4 years away. But there will be an opportunity for us to choose new leadership moving forward. When that time arises, the best way to make sure that we have someone with that vision is to elect someone to those positions who has that vision, who understands the need for us to communicate to our constituents what we want to do and why it is that we want to do it. It doesn't have to be elaborate. In fact, if there's one thing that I learned, there aren't necessarily a lot of skills that transfer well from my prior career. I'm an appellate litigator. Appellate litigators are the most awesome kind of lawyer there is. We're also the sexiest, the most appealing, as evidenced by the fact that all the law shows that you see, they're all about appellate litigators. We mostly write briefs, and then we show up for an argument that lasts anywhere from a half an hour to an hour and a half, and it's really exciting. But not all skills from being an appellate litigator transfer well into politics. In fact, my staff wishes that they could erase my memory as an appellate litigator, because it leads you to do things like answer a question as it was asked to you rather than the question you wish you were asked. Makes for bad TV interviews. But one thing that I did learn as an appellate litigator that transfers well into politics is this. When you're wanting to make a pitch, whether it's to a court or to an electorate, try to keep your list of requests confined to no more than 5 asks, ideally no more than 3 asks in one sitting. And that's why I think it can be very helpful. People praise the Contract of America. Contract of America could have been better had they reduced it to 3 things. And that's why I would choose the 3 that I just chose. And that's why I think the next time we have an opportunity, whether that is months away, or 2 years away, or 4 years away for new Senate leadership, that's what I'm going to be looking for. Somebody willing to stand in the breach, to go right into the flame, and stand up for freedom, and do so articulately, concisely, and boldly, so that the American people know what we will do to protect their life and their liberty and their property. It's when we do that that we win, and we as a country are safer, more prosperous, and more free.
Well said. One more question? One more question for Senator Lee. Sorry, my eyes. Oh, yes, sir, please.
Senator Lee, if Rich Little ever needs a replacement, you'd be the ideal one.
What's that?
Rich Little. Very good impersonation, by the way. Getting serious. About a decade ago, many of us in this room heard you deliver a speech at Texas Review of Law and Politics when you were being honored. You talked about the REINS Act, and that keen mind and wonderful spirit of yours basically distinguished between legislation. I think you pulled out a piece of legislation that Congress had passed about 100 years ago and how detailed it was in terms of not only the legislation that was being passed, but the execution of that legislation and the feedback loops to check if it worked. And then you pulled out, I think, the Clean Water Act or Clean Air Act, which said we're going to have clean water and the bureaucrats are going to decide everything else. If you could give us like a minute or two synopsis of the REINS Act and then also answer a very specific question, which is, do you think it would make sense for everybody who's running for president to take the oath that they would sign on to that? And for everybody who's running for Congress, the same thing.
Okay, fantastic. First of all, let me hit those in reverse order because the second more specific question is more susceptible to a short answer. Yes, I think that's a fantastic idea. We should have everyone who's running for federal office of any kind sign something saying, I promise to do that, I promise to make that a priority. And it's when I met with President Trump right after he was elected, it was the first thing I told him that I thought he should do. I think from this moment forward, we should have that. So I like that. Secondly, thank you for, I'm so honored.
Someone paid attention.
Yeah, somebody paid, and this was
10 years ago.
This was 10 years ago, and I love that event. And you guys gave me a bobblehead, a Mike Lee bobblehead that said Jurist of the Year on it, and it was just fantastic. My kids love those. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, here's what he's talking about. I'm so glad you raised this. The way we make laws these days, as opposed to the way laws are supposed to be made, the way laws were made, say, 100 and more years ago in Congress, they actually contained the detail needed so that those subject to the laws would know what they were expected to do. This is important. It goes far back into our history. In Federalist Number 62, James Madison describes this. He said, "It will be of little avail to the American people if their laws be so voluminous, complex, and ever-changing that those subject to them don't know and can't anticipate what the law is today and how it might be different tomorrow." And today, it's not just that the laws are so voluminous, complex, and ever-changing. They're not even written by men and women of our own choosing. They're written by unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats. And here's why. Because as opposed to those laws as they previously existed, before that dark day of April 12th, 1937, and I really can trace it to that day, because the minute Congress became that much more powerful, it had to make that many more laws and that many more subjects, including things like labor and manufacturing and agriculture and mining. And you tick somebody off every time you make a specific law, because a law always has winners and losers. Anyone who benefits from it also is counterbalanced by somebody who is hurt. So Congress figured out a way around this to deal both with the increased labor, increased demands on the time that it takes to make a law, and to shield themselves from political accountability. We started passing platitudes. So things like, for example, the Clean Air Act. We shall have clean air. It's a slight oversimplification, but it's about what it says. And we hereby declare that we shall have clean air, and we hereby delegate to the EPA the power to decide what clean air is, what pollution is, and what happens to polluters. Make it so, EPA. And they go off and they do some crazy stuff. Now, don't get me wrong, the Clean Air Act has cleaned up the air. I'm not criticizing the objective of cleaning up the air, and there's even an interstate commerce nexus to that, because those are interstate channels that are being regulated. But the way we do that, that's not legislation. Those are platitudes. And we're empowering little mini fiefdoms, little mini monarchs, people who can't be removed. That's why we fought that war, and we won that freaking war. So we shouldn't be doing it this way. It's relevant on all sorts of areas. OSHA, for example. We shall have safe workplaces. What idiot's going to vote against that? Until you read the fine print, well, there is no fine print other than we hereby delegate to OSHA the power to make and interpret and enforce rules to make sure that we're safe in the workplace. And guess what happens next? Any employer with more than 99 employees will hereby be fined $15,000 per person per day for each worker who remains unvaccinated. And, you know, it took federal litigation, and it took months for us to get that overturned. And some of that stuff still lingers to this day. That's why this is such a threat. And that's why the REINS Act matters. The REINS Act flips it on its head. Remember, this isn't just a lofty or novel or creative statutory objective. This is what the Constitution already requires. The very first clause of the very first section of the very first article of the Constitution says, the first operative provision after the preamble, which is lovely but does nothing operative, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Article 1, Section 7 then outlines the formula by which federal law is created. You cannot pass a federal law without bicameral passage of the same measure by the House and by the Senate, followed by presentment to the President for signature, veto, or acquiescence. All the REINS Act does is to make good on that promise, saying that anytime you're dealing with executive rulemaking on what they call a major rule based on its economic impact and it requires the public to comply rather than just deciding what time the lights go on or off in the Department of State. All major rules will not take effect automatically. In fact, they won't be able to take effect at all unless or until both houses of Congress have signed on to it, passed it into law, and submitted it to the President for signature, veto, or acquiescence. That's why we need it. Because it's it itself. So the court is the linchpin of the three branches. That is the linchpin of the legislative powers. And by the way, the most dangerous branch and the most powerful branch is the legislative branch. And the most powerful thing we could do to protect us from it and the dangers that can flow from it is the REINS Act.
Please help me thank the amazing Senator Mike Lee.